Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story. It's Tuesday, and we're in the book of Hosea, chapter 6 today. I'm with Chris Rexroad and Alyssa Bream. There's a verse that triggered the question that I want to talk about today. So verse 8 begins by saying, Gilead is a city of sinners, tracked with footprints of blood. Priests form bands of robbers, waiting in ambush for their victims. They murder travelers along the road to Shechem and practice every kind of sin. Yes, I have seen something horrible in Ephraim, and Israel. My people are defiled by prostituting themselves with other gods. So, and like if this is your first time joining us, we're not trying to offer some theological discussion on the entire chapter of Hosea 6 in this setup. We're taking a question that could be asked from this, a practical question, and talking about it. So the question I want to talk about today is this verse says the priests were forming bands of robbers and murdering people along the road. How do pastors, priests, and religious leaders set the tone for the moral and spiritual compass of the world? Like, that's kind of what I want us to talk about today. Because I want to say out of the gate that I don't know how I can't in my mind process the steps that as a religious leader, pastor, priest, that you get to the place where you would form a cohort of robbers. But I have literally seen pastors rob people. Like, just manipulate them and take their money for their own personal gain and not for the good of the kingdom. And so it may happen without a gun, or waiting in ambush, but I think it still happens today in multiple ways. And so I don't think that's the only place, but I do think greed, and maybe that's the jumping off point there. I do think greed is rampant in the world and at least present in the church. I'm scared to use the word prevalent. That bothers me because that paints a broad brush. But it is at least present in the church, and probably more so in certain types of churches. Mm-hmm. So how do priests, pastors, religious leaders set the moral tone for the world? And let's talk about greed first. Do you think we're having an impact on the greediness of the world, or is the world having an impact on the church?
Well, responsibility-wise, we're supposed to follow what God tells us to do. And if there are things outside of that, not only are we supposed to own the lifestyle that we're supposed to live and the way we conduct ourselves and how we teach, but we're also supposed to be understanding of other people, but not to become like that. And when I read something like this, it's like a lot of other things. When you see like marriages, go in the pits, it didn't happen overnight. Usually there was some sort of compromise or a person in the religious group here that, what's the word I'm looking for? That they just became somebody that was allowing things to happen, or they began to compromise and do what they wanted to do and developed a system of people being acceptant of those things, and it just snowballs into something a whole lot bigger, to where you end up with something that's nothing like what you began with. So by following their own ways, people can become that way. It seems horrible to think that people in these positions would have gotten to that point, but sometimes people find ways to justify their actions. Like, were they getting together to rob a group of people that robbed their people? Not that that was right or anything, but I could just see how some of those things could happen. But as far as us today, we're supposed to set the example to others around us, and not just acting that way in the proper setting, but actually allowing that mentality of following Christ to be who we are. And it just comes out wherever we're at. We're still flawed. We still mess up at times. We still have bad days, but that would be my answer to that.
Probably going to take us on a right turn here, but it connects to greed. When we were in Israel, we went to the Holocaust Museum, and there was a video on anti-Semitism that I think a lot of us stood around and watched because our tour guide had said, hey, this is like a 7-minute video. It really gives you a good basis, stay and watch it. And it kind of talked about anti-Semitism, but a lot of anti-Semitism was rooted in religious reasons, but it was also in greed because they saw that Jewish families had found ways to make money and they were jealous of that and they didn't like that. And so they started to spread rumors about it. They started saying, Jews are the ones that killed Jesus. We need to. And so, I mean, you can see how that swept into the Holocaust and led there. I think we underestimate not only how much religious leaders can affect a community, but also a country, but we also can see how leaders can use religion to affect and sway the masses. When you look back at which countries in Europe fell into totalitarianism, every single one of them is one that departed Catholicism and went to Protestantism. And I would love to read more about that, how that kind of came to be, but every single country that had a dictator rise had gone to Protestantism. And I think there's something there. There's some sort of connection there where that change of religion created totalitarianism.
I don't know if I commented to you. I know I commented to Barbara when I walked away from that video, but I and a couple of other people I made this remark to. Watching that video should remind all Christians how easily through history we've been deceived to participate in stuff we had no business being a part of. And I wanted to follow that up with some more modern day examples, but it is so easy if you just mix a little bit of religion in. You said maybe these are people that have robbed us. I think about an anti-Semitic statement that is terminology that people around me grew up with. Do y'all have any idea what it is?
I think I know.
Yeah, because it's something that I'm good at. When we say negotiate or try to get a better price, we say Jew them down. Well, that comes from their financial knowledge and understanding to negotiate good deals, to be able to manage money well, to try to streamline things. And for some people, when they say it, they don't mean it negatively, right? They say it as, okay, you're good at that, but it is not a positive connotation. But we pick it up in our terminology and we don't realize it. And I would say, this is that really difficult balance, because I am not the most politically correct person. Okay.
Yes.
Yes. What?
What did you call me at one point? I don't know. The diversity.
Yeah, you're the diversity.
So I'm the one that's like, that's not politically correct, Stephen. You're like, I don't care.
Yeah. So I'm not the most politically correct person. And some of it is unnecessary, but other pieces of it we should be aware of because it does have the ability to tilt our subconscious to wrong. Because if I were to ask you today, like we're just sitting here on this podcast, whoever's going to listen to it, can you think of a pathway that I could convince you to do something immoral or illegal? I believe your answer would be immediately no, right?
I'd like to think so.
You want to say that, right?
Right.
I want to believe that I would never ask you to do something immoral or illegal. Like, I want to believe that. But I see so many people and places fall into that trap that there have to be steps, usually subconscious steps, that we don't even realize they're happening. So, one of the things we when we go on staff, when we have a staff retreat, we'll usually eat one big meal together. And almost every time I will say, remember, this is a privilege, not a right. Like, this is not something that you're promised to, that happens. Because I can see in my mind how, okay, that becomes a commonplace thing. I remember this had not this group, but I want to make sure nobody takes this out of context. Not in this group. It was part of the denomination I was in, and they went. They had a famous preacher in to preach, which I didn't. I was opposed to him coming to preach to begin with. Not because of his theology, because he didn't have much, but mostly because they were paying him $25,000 to preach, and this would have been in the late 90s. So
Wow.
$25,000 is a lot of money today, but 25 years ago, that was unheard of. But they took he and all of his team to dinner, and there were probably 20 people, to a very nice steakhouse. And so I'm a driver. I'm the peon on the group, so I'm a driver. I didn't even get to eat with them. I was a pastor, but I'm a peon pastor. That's how I would describe it. And the meal for like 20 people was $10,000, and they paid for it with a church credit card. Nobody flinched. Like, just, yeah, whatever. And what I believe can happen is sometimes you get a privilege, that happens occasionally, that you begin to think, okay, I deserve this. I work hard. I don't get paid a lot of money. And that's easy for preachers to say, sometimes I'm not paid what I'm worth. I could make more money somewhere else. So if I'm getting this perk, that's great. And then the perk becomes a right, and it just becomes this progressive thing to where you feel like you deserve it now, and you don't think anything about it. You don't become particular about it. And I think it has to be steps. I've seen it happen way too often, how people start here, but it's not just the person. I mean, there's no way I can do illegal things here at this church without other people participating. Well, I mean, there would be some things, but they would usually be crimes against a person if that was going to be the case. But when it comes to finances and those kind of things, like, there would have to be other people involved. Have you ever found yourself in a situation or seen up close and personal where you saw those steps and people began to think something that was wrong, it became acceptable in their eyes?
This is probably what I was thinking about when you were saying that was the TV show Breaking Bad, how like just one step of like, I need some money, that I'll just do this
Right.
crime once.
So I watched a few episodes of that. That's where the guy starts the meth
selling
lab
meth.
Yeah,
right.
Okay,
it's a science teacher who has cancer and needs to fund his treatments
Right.
and provide for his family. So, one batch of meth becomes
Right.
he becomes the biggest crime lord who like takes down
He makes the
Mexican
greatest meth in the world.
cartels and like all of this. And well, as you're watching it, like, you're like, oh man, like if I was in a similar situation and I was presented with that opportunity, like, people are going to buy, like, you could almost like
Right.
see how you would take that first step. But then by the time you're seeing him
Yeah.
like
I can sell
confront
just-
Mexican drug lords with like such gusto, you're like, oh my goodness. And you're like, how did we get there? But when you watch it, it makes sense.
Right. I can sell just enough meth to retire,
Right.
and then I'm going to quit.
Right.
And then you don't.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Chasing the next level.
Yeah.
I guess I'll just label it as this. In an organization, I saw people that usually had control of the finances and had control of the direction of the organization, and became very comfortable using it for their own gains, I'll say. And there was some very obvious things that took place that should have never, but it's one of those things where I think that each step became okay over time, and it got to a point where they did stuff that in my mind was a little bit criminal, but highly, highly unethical. And people that you know they know better.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, it's just one of those things where people just become comfortable with a little bit more.
Yeah. And I mean, I got to be careful what I say here.
And usually they justify it to themselves.
But I've seen situations where there were people who were supporting in churches. If they had been, if somebody had audited the church, or the IRS had come put pressure on the church, there would have been a lot of trouble. Whether it rose to the level of criminality, I'm not sure. It certainly was wrong. It broke lots of rules and laws. But the church was successful, and people wanted that success to continue. And so they allowed those things to happen, even though they disapproved of them.
Mm-hmm.
And those are often the places they're like, okay, if my livelihood is dependent on this person's success, and so we're going to let things be. So I think those are the kinds of times where we get compromised and we don't realize it. We have to be careful. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back tomorrow as we continue our conversation in the book of Hosea.